What is it that we need in India? We have a large young population. We have still a population which is growing faster than most other countries. It's one of our strengths that we have such a young growing population because it makes for rapid growth of the domestic market. And it is the domestic market which has driven the Indian economic growth in the last several years. It is the strength of the domestic market which has insulated us from the worst of the recession which took place since last year. And it is the domestic market which makes us more competitive with the rest of the world, and which is an advantage which very few countries other than China and India enjoy, because it is the strength of the domestic market which will determine how competitive you become in the global markets. India needs to have an economic growth of at least 9 to 10% a year if we are to provide jobs for all the people who are entering the job markets and who are today coming out of educational institutions of various kinds and who are aspirants for a better quality of life. We must get to a 9 to 10% growth. This 9 to 10% growth, believe me, is not achievable if we do not grow in our manufacturing sector. The services sector cannot provide a 9 to 10% growth in this country on a sustained basis at all. It is the manufacturing sector which has to grow, and it is the manufacturing sector which has to sustain a high rate of growth and the growth of the services sector. So while the services sector, financial sectors, marketing have a great deal of glamour and a great deal of attraction, we must not forget the basic importance of manufacturing in this country, because it is that sector which will ultimately drive us. Along with the manufacturing sector is the agricultural sector. We still depend to a large extent on agriculture. More than 60% of our population is dependent on agriculture. Our agricultural productivity has been very, very low. Our growth per acre, what we produce per acre, is far, far lower than what most other countries are able to manage. And there's obviously enormous scope for people to apply skills and management practice systems and others to make sure that agricultural growth grows. Part of the reason is, of course, policies. I don't want to go into policies here, whether it's policies in the agricultural sector or the education sector, because I believe both these two key sectors are the areas where government policy over the last 15 years has failed to deregulate and liberalize, whereas it has happened in industry and trade and commerce. It has not happened in the basic activities which we should have been worrying about, and where we should have been having a much greater opening up of the system and giving freedom to the innate capabilities of Indians to improvise, grow, innovate, and create greater value than what can happen under the present system. But coming back to manufacturing, we must remember that China today is obviously considered to be a much more productive country, a much more lower cost manufacturing country than we are. But China will not remain alone in that area. We have other countries in the developing world which are coming up, countries like Vietnam and Cambodia. These countries in the course of time are going to become very, very competitive, and therefore it becomes all the more important for our country to look at what we can do to bring about a higher level of competitiveness in the manufacturing sector. Now, why is Indian manufacturing not as competitive as China is? We have heard people say, oh, this is because the Chinese government subsidizes their industry. There is no proper financial costing in China, and so on and so forth. Stories which I used to hear earlier on when Japan had become the most competitive manufacturing country in the world, and the general belief in India, what our people, I was then in government, what people talked about was that, oh, Japan subsidizes, so how can we compete with them? As it turned out, that was nowhere near the truth. And I don't believe it's the truth that China subsidizes its industries or its financial system is so geared that they can keep exporting literally hundreds of billions of dollars of goods on a subsidized basis. I don't think any country can do that. Certainly, the systems in China where decision making is centralized, quicker, helps in making investments flow there. But believe me, the democratic system which we have in India on long-term basis will prove much more robust than any system which does not involve people in decision making. But having said that, it does not mean that a democratic system should become less competitive than any other system. In China, decisions are made at the top. In Japan, decision making is done from the bottom. It does not mean that the top-down decision making is necessarily more efficient. And the same thing applies in India, where in a democracy, decisions are by consensus. And we have to remember the value of democracy in creating acceptable, sustainable decisions which people will not question afterwards. What brings us down in India is the fact that our infrastructure management and our infrastructure creation is well below the level which is required for a progressive industrial country. Costs of infrastructure certainly add substantially to manufacturing costs. As anybody who has looked at manufacturing or been involved in manufacturing will find that it is higher infrastructure costs, whether you generate your own power by having diesel generating sets, you have to provide your own transport because the railways are not adequate to carry your goods quickly from place to place, where the road sector gets costly because of bad road maintenance, inadequate roads, bridges which are not satisfactory and such things. Ports add to cost because of huge delays in clearance of goods from the ports. Ships take days to berth, and all of that kind of stuff is happening, and we have to find answers to that. Fortunately, the present government is much more alive to the need for better infrastructure building, and I hope that's one area which in the coming years will get addressed better. Second part is the high cost of doing business in India, because there's a whole lot of transaction costs which are non-value adding but which are incurred because of outdated rules, regulations, laws, the need to provide employment to people who have been there in a system for a long time. And I think that's an area which the government needs to look at. But the point I'd like to make and emphasize is that when we are trying to become more competitive and more productive, we must not only look at the external factors which add to our cost. We must look inwards, because there's much more which can be done by looking at what you're doing inwards than what you can do by looking outwards. In most companies, most organizations, if something goes wrong, the tendency is to find an alibi for that by blaming somebody outside the system. My suggestion to you is that when you are in your employment, don't find scapegoats outside the system. First look inwards, and you'll find that in most instances